Welcome back to my YouTube channel. You might hear my fan up there. It's really hot in this room and I cannot find the remote control to turn it off without the lights, and I need the lights to be able to film, so I'm hoping during the editing process I can get it tuned out as much as possible, but if you do hear it, I'm really sorry. But welcome back. Thank you for joining me again. If you're new here, thank you so much for coming. I'm excited to have you, and if you're returning, thanks for coming back. I'm so excited to see you again. Here's a little reminder that if you like true crime, which is something that I talk about, or like the paranormal or anything like that, you can hit the little subscribe button down below. You can also hit the bell icon to be notified when I upload if you want to. So yeah, I also want to give a quick warning that some of the things that we talk about can be pretty heavy. So if that's something your mental health cannot handle, just do me a favor and click off this video, because your mental health will always be so much more important than any YouTube video ever will be. Another just tidbit of information: sometimes some of the things that we talk about, the people that we talk about, some of their relatives or their family members are still alive and present, very much present today. So always remember that when you're commenting or having conversations about true crime, because you don't want to hurt somebody who is still being affected by these very real stories. With all of that being said, let's go ahead and jump into today's video. Today's video is about the Mullendoore case. I have never heard of this case before, and it was actually my lovely coworker Mary who brought it to my attention. So I figured that we talk about it here, since I've never heard anyone else talk about it, and I thought it would be kind of an interesting story to talk about. This story is set in Osage County, Oklahoma, at the Crossbell Ranch. The Crossbell Ranch was started by Eugene Claremont Mullendoore Sr. Eugene, better known as Gene, was born in Cleveland, Oklahoma in 1905. Gene would marry Kathleen, and Kathleen was born in Caney, Kansas in 1905 as well. And when Kathleen was born, her parents took her to the Osage Indian Agency in Oklahoma so that her birth could be registered. Anytime their birth was registered with the Osage tribe, they were given a portion of the mineral rights that the tribe had inherited, and also 640 acres of land. Gene and Kathleen married on December 21st in 1926 in Caney, Kansas. Soon after they got married, they took that 640 acres and started farming that land. They would then go on to buy Kathleen's parents' small ranch that was really close to the Crossbell Ranch, and then they bought another neighboring ranch. After they bought all of this land, they had one of the largest ranches in Oklahoma history. They would get 130,000 acres of land. The ranch was pretty much self-sufficient. They grew everything on their own, and they also had several prized animals. Most importantly, the animals that they were very proud of were their quarter horses and also their mules. The Crossbell Ranch would actually contract with the U.S. Army and sell several head of mules to the Army to be used in war. The Crossbell Ranch would also be massively successful when it came to cattle, and at one point they were the largest cattle distributor on the Santa Fe Railroad. So needless to say, the Mullendoores did not need or want for anything. Gene and Kathleen worked very hard for their success though. Kathleen and Gene were very good people, I guess you could say. They had 2 children. They had a daughter named Katsy, and then a son named Eugene Claremont Mullendoore III, but Eugene, their son, would go as E.C. Mullendoore. The Mullendoores had so much money that they even had a small plane that Kathleen would get a pilot's license for, so that she could fly around all of their land and see if any of their animals had gotten out. That way she could call back down to Gene, her husband, and tell them where these animals had gotten out and what they needed to do to get them back in. But it wasn't just that. Kathleen would also take this airplane to fly into town to get groceries and all those kinds of things. E.C. and Katsy were born into the lap of luxury. They never wanted for anything, and they always had what they needed and what they wanted. They were very, very wealthy people. But when E.C. was only 22 years old in 1960, Gene, or Eugene Sr., actually started losing his eyesight, and this caused him to want to kind of slow down on the ranch and slow down on work, period. So he actually handed over the reins to EC, and EC started overseeing the ranch's operation. EC was much more lenient about spending money than his father Gene was, and EC immediately started making upgrades to the ranch. On ranches like this, you'll often see them having like housing quarters for their hands and the people that work for them. And Gene had never put in running water in these houses, and so they were kind of living off grid in these these houses that they had. And EC was one to immediately go in and kind of upgrade these houses, give them running water, make sure that they were really well taken care of. He was very concerned about making sure that his hands were also taken care of. EC was married to Linda. EC and Linda were high school sweethearts, and they got married pretty quickly after high school. Not only did they want to make sure that their hired help was taken care of and that they had better living arrangements, but they also lived very extravagantly. EC and Linda liked to spend money. Linda would often fly to Dallas in that private plane I was telling you about and go shopping, but these were not little shopping trips. She would go get her hair done, she would go buy everything for the kids that they wanted. She would easily spend upwards of $20,000 on these trips to Dallas to shop. And $20,000 in the 1970s when this was taking place is $150,000 in today's money. So these were not small shopping trips at all. But EC was good for it. He had a ton of money, the family had a ton of money, so this really didn't seem like that big of a deal. EC's net worth was estimated to be about $37 million, which is $290 million in today's money. So a $20,000 shopping spree is really just a drop in the bucket if you're worth $290 million. But these shopping trips and the parties that they like to throw, and EC liked to drink, and he liked to drink a lot, and he liked to drink fancy stuff. Eventually, this lifestyle would end up catching up with them, and EC would find himself in upwards of $12 million in debt. They would take out mortgages on the mansion that they lived in Crossbell Ranch. EC had ways. He had massive credit lines, obviously, for this massive ranch. He would have a pretty significant credit line, but eventually he would run this credit line out too, and he was struggling for money. Banks were no longer wanting to give money to him, and he just didn't know where he was going to get this $12 million to pay off his creditors. So he started looking at alternative ways of getting money, and this is when you start hearing rumors about EC running with gang members from the mob in like Kansas City. He would take out lines of credit with them and then wasn't necessarily able to pay them back all the time. EC would eventually hire a man named Damon Tucker Anderson. Damon liked to go by the name of Chub, so that's how I'm going to refer to him from now on. But he hired Chub to be like a ranch hand, but also to be like his personal bodyguard, and that would eventually morph into more of a friendship. They really enjoyed each other's company, and they liked to party together, and they liked to hang out a lot. But EC was also someone who liked to start a lot of fights that Chub would have to finish. But this is just how their relationship worked. They would go out, party together, Chub would finish EC's fights, and that's just how it was. So it was more of like this friendship, but also this boss-employee relationship. It was kind of a strange thing, but it worked for them. Chub would often see men coming to the ranch that had a more of a nefarious feel to them, looking for money from EC, and EC would always tell them that he was good for the money and that he was gonna pay them back. He just needed some more time, and Chub was starting to get nervous about this. But Chub wasn't the only one getting nervous. Linda was also worried because she didn't know what exactly was going on and where EC was. It seems like she didn't really know about the money struggles that EC was going through, but she did notice these men coming on the property, and it scared her. EC seemed to be losing it, kind of. He seemed to be not things were just falling apart in both Linda and EC's lives. They couldn't seem to really get it together, and Linda was really starting to get sick of EC's constant drinking. He was constantly drinking, and he was constantly doing things that just made her nervous because they had small children together and she wanted to make sure that the kids were okay. She loved EC, but she didn't think that she could live like this. So eventually Linda decided that she was going to pack up her stuff and the kids' stuff and that she was going to take them to Tulsa. After this, EC really, he didn't want her to leave. He didn't want a divorce with Linda, and this really upset him. Linda would come out later and say that she didn't really want to divorce EC, but she just more so wanted to scare him straight, thinking that if she left with the children, that EC would recognize that this was serious, that she needed a change in their lives in order to make this marriage work. But Linda went as far as filing for divorce. She hired an attorney in Tulsa, and then the attorneys that she was working through contacted the Osage Sheriff's Department with the paperwork that needed to be served to EC. Here's where the timeline gets a little bit weird because I'm not entirely sure if this is exactly how it went down, but Chub was in contact with the Osage County Sheriff's Department, and they had told Chub that they needed to serve EC this divorce paperwork. Chub agreed to pull over when the deputy came to serve EC and allow EC to be served. So on September 26th of 1970, a deputy from the Osage Sheriff's Department came to the Crossbell Ranch to serve EC the paperwork. Now, they had made an agreement with Chub that Chub would pull over and allow EC to be served, and he did pull over at first when he saw the deputy, but then Chub says that EC told him to floor it, to leave, to get away from this deputy. And so EC had this like weird feeling, like he didn't know, because he was like, you know, I've made an agreement with the sheriff's department to pull over and allow EC to be served, but he also had a connection with EC and he had like this bond with him, so he felt loyalty to him and didn't know what to do. But Chub ended up taking off and getting away from this sheriff's deputy. Chub knew this ranch like the back of his hand. He knew exactly where to go and how to avoid the sheriff's deputy, and eventually they would lose them. But EC didn't understand why Chub had pulled over at first. He didn't understand why he was allowing this deputy to pull them over on his own ranch, and so a fight broke out that night. Sometime later in the evening, Chub would call 911, and he called and said that EC Mullendoore had been shot. The neighboring county, which was Washington County, was actually the first sheriff's office to come to the scene of the crime. By the time the Osage County Sheriff was notified that there had been a shooting at the Mullendoore Ranch, it was too late. When he showed up, the crime scene had been completely destroyed. EC's body had been taken to the local hospital, even though he was dead at the scene, and everyone had just kind of trampled through the crime scene, so there wasn't really anything that they could salvage. It was very well known that EC could not have survived the gunshot he had suffered, and so EC's body being taken to the hospital was a huge blow to the investigation. Even though the crime scene had been completely obliterated, they did have eyewitness testimony. Chub was there at the time of the crime. Chub said he was upstairs filling a bath to take a bath, and he heard the gunshots from downstairs. Chub said that he ran downstairs and found EC's body. He had been shot and he was not alive. Chub says that while he was examining EC, he was shot from behind in the shoulder, and when he turned around, he saw two men fleeing the scene. Chub said he did chase after them and try to get them, and he even tried to shoot at them himself, but was unable to get them, and they were able to leave. Chub says that that's when he made the phone call to the sheriff's department and then sought medical treatment for his own wounds that he had suffered that night. The sheriff had a huge job ahead of him, considering that the crime scene was completely destroyed and all he had was this eyewitness testimony from Chub. But the thing was is that EC had not made a lot of friends. Not only was he in debt to the mob, there were plenty of people who didn't care to see him dead or alive. He had a lot of enemies. Sheriff George Wayman was the Osage County Sheriff at the time. He didn't exactly believe Chub's story from beginning to end. He thought that there was something weird going on. Linda Mullendoore had been in Tulsa with her kids at the time, and she was also kind of skeptical about what had happened in EC's murder, so she actually hired a private investigator named Gary Glanz to escort her during this time, making sure that she and her children were also safe. And Gary Glanz also wasn't entirely convinced by Chub's story. Gary Glanz was very effective in the investigation, and as soon as he was given access into the Mullendoore home, he started running a couple of tests to see if he could back up Chub's story and see if this was actually what happened. He went upstairs to the bathroom that Chub said he was running a bath and began running a bath himself. He then had someone fire a couple of shots in the room that EC had been killed in to see if he could hear the gunshots from upstairs. Now, when the bath was running, he couldn't hear anything at all, but when the water wasn't running, he did hear like some knocks, but it didn't sound like gunshots, more like a book had fallen off of a shelf or something like that. So right away, Chub's story isn't making complete sense, and he just feels like there's something wrong about it. Gary also wondered why they hadn't finished the job with Chub. Like, why had these mob characters allowed Chub to live when he was an eyewitness to what had happened to EC that night? It just didn't quite make sense. Another thing that was very hard for Gary Glanz to understand was Chub was an excellent shot. Chub was one of those men that was like a man's man. He was all boy all the time. And something about him was he was a gun enthusiast, and he was an excellent shot. Not often did he miss. So why was it that Chub had missed this night? And you could kind of write it off as, well, he was shot, and so it's a different story. He's not, you know, at full capacity, but he was such a man's man always, and he was shot in the shoulder, but why did he miss this night? It just didn't quite make sense. There was also dew on the ground in the morning when the sheriff's office got there, and they started looking around, and there was only one set of footprints in the dew in the grass. If there were two people making their escape, why was there only one set of footprints? It's not adding up. Chub's story is just not completely adding up here. During EC's funeral, Gary was there with Linda and their children, and he set it up that he would run into Chub after the funeral. He wanted to be able to speak to Chub, and he did just that. He ran into Chub after the funeral, and they started talking. But to Gary's surprise, he really liked Chub. Chub was personable, he was funny, he was easy to get along with, and he actually quite enjoyed talking with him. So Chub and Gary would almost become friendly during this investigation. In fact, they become such good friends that Chub would often call Gary just to talk, just to kind of shoot the shit and see what was going on. And a lot of times, Gary would actually go meet up with Chub, and they would just have conversations in his car. A lot of these conversations Gary actually recorded, and he would question Chub about what happened that night and what exactly had gone on, because his story that he had told investigators was not making any sense. Gary told Chub that the evidence wasn't lining up and that something was very wrong about the investigation. He said that the gunshots that they did find inside the home that Chub said he had shot when he was trying to get these two intruders, they actually were able to prove that they were fake and that they weren't, or that Chub had just kind of shot at the door. Gary also told Chub that the sheriff did not believe his story. The sheriff, George Wayman, had a completely different theory about what went on. It was very common for Chub and EC to get into arguments, just in general. They had one of those friendships that, like I said, EC liked to start fights that Chub had to finish. This would really irritate Chub because he just didn't want to be involved in that. Sheriff George Wayman believes that the night that EC was shot and killed, that was the same night that they ran away from the deputy, hoping that EC would not be served. The sheriff believes that when they got back to the Mullendoore home, there was a fight that broke out between EC and Chub, and EC wanted to know why Chub hadn't ran in the first place and why he had first attempted to stop. During the autopsy, they were able to find that EC had not only been shot, but he had also been beaten to an absolute pulp. There was obviously a physical altercation that had happened before EC lost his life, and the Sheriff Wayman, he believes that the fight broke out between EC and Chub absolutely beat EC up beyond recognition, and knowing that he had gone too far, he had no choice but to kill EC. The caliber of weapon that was used in EC's murder was the exact same caliber that EC actually had in the home himself. It was a gun that he owned himself, and that gun was never found, and the murder weapon was never found. The sheriff believes that Chub threw out the weapon while he was driving to the hospital, and that's why they had never found it. Gary Glanz, the private investigator, told Chub that he had a good case for self-defense and that he probably wouldn't even see any jail time if he just told the truth about what happened that night. But Chub refused. He refused to tell the exact story. He refused to say anything. But I do think it's important to note that Chub did not deny it, but he also didn't admit it. He just kind of let it go. Even though the sheriff thought that Chub was actually the one who pulled the trigger and killed EC, no charges were ever filed, and Chub just kind of disappeared. Chub would spend time in Mexico before coming back, and he spent some time in Kansas. There he did rack up a couple of marijuana charges, and he would flee Kansas and go to Montana. There he would use somebody else's name, someone who had passed away years ago. He assumed their identity and started working in Montana. And he seemed to live a pretty quiet life in Montana until he started facing some health challenges in Montana and trying to go to the hospital. They were unable to help him there because they found that he was using an alias from someone who had died several years prior, and that's when they found out that his real name was Damon Anderson, or Chub, and they actually found out that he had active warrants out for his arrest in the state of Kansas. So Chub was arrested in Montana and then extradited back to Kansas, where he would spend some time in prison for these marijuana charges that he had evaded several years prior. At this point, 20 years has gone by since EC's death, and no one knows exactly what happened to him still. Excuse me. The sheriff and Gary Glanz are pretty sure they know what happened, but they haven't filed any charges in the case of EC's murder. After he was released from prison in Kansas, Chub found himself in Caney, Kansas, and that's when he decided to reach back out to Gary Glanz and kind of start their friendship over again. Gary Glanz was extremely excited to hear from Chub after 20 plus years had gone by and he hadn't heard from Chub. He immediately agreed that he would come from Tulsa to Caney to come spend some time with Chub and have conversations with him. Each of these interviews were recorded, and they talked about what happened. It was after a couple of times that Gary came down from Tulsa to visit Chub that Chub finally admitted to what happened, and Gary got all of this on tape. Chub says that the night that EC died, there was a physical altercation that happened between the two of them. Chub claims that he doesn't remember exactly what started the physical altercation, but it was actually EC that pulled the gun on Chub. Chub was able to grab the gun from EC and he hit him in the head with it. Chub then says that the gun went off accidentally and hit EC and he died. There was a hired hand that EC had actually fired that day, and he was waiting outside because Chub had agreed to take him back into town later that night after EC fell asleep. He was hiding in one of the children's playground equipment things, like in one of their little houses, their playhouses, and when Chub had killed EC, Chub goes out, gets his hired hand, and tells him that he needs to shoot him in the shoulder so that he can tell police that there was intruders actually that had killed EC. He said he felt the need to cover it up because he didn't want to be charged for EC's murder, even though he claimed it was all done in self-defense. Gary Glanz had recorded all of this, like I said, and he actually took this to Sheriff George Wayman, but Sheriff Wayman said that this was not something that they could use and they couldn't take it, to the court systems or anything, and that this wasn't enough for them to press charges against Chub for what had happened. Sheriff Wayman tried to interview him several times himself, but Chub just kind of tells him that this is probably something he wants to die with. Like, he's not going to tell Sheriff Wayman. Sheriff Wayman even told him that they were not going to send him to prison for anything, that all he had to do was get it off his conscience, and that they would not press charges against him or send him to prison, that he would be free to go if he just told them the truth of what happened. But Chub would not do it. He would not tell the sheriff what had happened the night that EC died, and yeah.
You know what, we come up here.
Well, I guess just to talk.
Well, I know it, but, you know, we've had this almost 40 years since this happened. 38 years, I guess, right? Or 39. Been much said about it, much wrote about it. And you're the one that knows what happened.
Well, I'll probably take it to my grave, Mr. George.
Well, you might do it, but
Chub Anderson would die in 2010 after several health complications, and it seems like the truth died with him. Like I said, there is an entire recorded confession of Chub admitting that he was in fact the perpetrator in EC's crime, but no charges have ever been filed in the EC Mullendoore case, and it seems like that's how it's going to stay. So I don't know, technically this case is completely unsolved, and it seems like it'll always be unsolved, but personally I really do believe that Chub was the one who murdered EC and just never told anyone. And had the crime scene not been completely destroyed before the Osage County Sheriff's Office got there, I think the Mullendoore family would have gotten a little bit of justice in this case. But what are your thoughts on it? I am absolutely dying to know what y'all think about this, and yeah. I think Chub did it, and maybe I don't think it was necessarily ill-intentioned. It does seem like EC did have a little bit of a anger issue, I guess you could say, so it probably was in self-defense, but I do think that the Mullendoores deserve to know exactly what happened, especially EC's kids. I think that it would have been good for them to know exactly what happened to their father and why it happened, but yeah. Let me know your thoughts about this case down in the comments. Please remember to remain respectful because the Mullendoores are still very much alive and well and still running the ranch. It is still in the family. As far my research led me to believe that it was still in the Mullendoore family. But yeah, let me know your thoughts, and here's another reminder to hit the subscribe button if you're interested in this kind of thing, and the bell icon so you can be notified when I upload. And if you feel like liking the video, I will be okay with that too. It helps out my channel and it helps push me out into the algorithm a little bit more. But yeah, thank you so much for being here. I hope you have an absolutely beautiful day, and I will see you soon.